Welcome to Instructional Design the Real World, the podcast where we explore learning and development, instructional design, leadership, and coaching strategies tailored for real-life application. I'm your host, Courtney Grabsky, and today we're talking about something that impacts every single learner, the forgetting curve. Now, we've all been there. You learn something new, and a week later, it feels like half of it has completely slipped away. Why does this happen? And more importantly, what can we do about it? Today, we're going to explore how the brain processes information, why we tend to forget, and some simple research-backed strategies to help us retain more of what we learn. So let's dive in. First, let's talk about the forgetting curve itself. The idea comes from a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus, who studied memory back in the late 1800s. Ebbinghaus discovered that when we learn new information, we tend to forget it rapidly at first, with our memory dropping off steadily within the first few hours or days. Then, over time, the rate of forgetting slows down, but by then, much of what we initially learned has already faded away. Interesting fact, the research is showing that we forget up to 50% of new information within an hour, and up to 70% within 24 hours. And that's a pretty sobering statistic. So, knowing this, how do we tackle the problem? Ebbinghaus's work revealed something really interesting. The rate at which we forget is not fixed. It is something that we can influence with the right strategies. And this is key for any instructional designer to understand and plan for within their content creation. So instead of thinking of forgetting as inevitable, let's view it as a challenge that we can overcome. With the right techniques, we can slow down the forgetting curve and retain information more effectively over the long term. Before we dive into the specifics and the different strategies that will help us beat the forgetting curve, it's helpful to understand why we forget in the first place. And there are a few major reasons that researchers believe lead to forgetting. Number 1. Lack of use. Most of us have heard the saying, use it or lose it. And in this case, that is absolutely true. One big reason we forget is that we simply don't use the information. If you don't reinforce what you've learned, your brain doesn't see it as important. So it clears out that information to make space for new information. Interference. So this happens when new information competes with older information. For example, if you're learning multiple new skills at once, you might mix up the details or forget something from earlier on. And number 3, stress and overload. So we are human. We have human brains. We are not robots. If you are tired, stressed, or overloaded, your ability to retain information drops significantly. When we're juggling too many things, it's hard for our brain to focus on any one piece of information long enough to really encode it into our long-term memory. So, to beat the forgetting curve, we need to find ways to reinforce the information we've learned. We need to make it relevant. And we need to avoid overloading our brains with too much at once. Now, let's get into the good stuff here. How do we tackle the forgetting curve? I'm going to share some practical science-backed strategies that you can apply right away to help what you learn stick. So, number 1 is incredibly important, and it's spaced repetition. The first and probably most powerful technique is spaced repetition. This is where you review information at increasing intervals over time. So instead of cramming all at once, you study a little bit, you take a break, and then you review it again, spacing out your practice. A really important component to spaced intervals is allowing yourself to sleep in between. So sort of think of the difference between this of cramming for an assessment, where you cram and study all night, and that next morning, you do okay, you pass that test. But a week from then, 2 weeks from then, how much of that information do you remember? Instead, imagine you study for that test over the course of 2 weeks, and maybe you set aside time to study every other day. That spaced repetition over time will increase the chances of that information being retained into your long-term memory. Just a quick example. Let's say you learned something new today. You might review it again tomorrow, and then in a few days, then in a week, then in a month. Each time you review, you are strengthening your memory of that information. And this can become incredibly impactful for things that maybe don't happen as frequently, but that you still need to remember for when you need it. So a good question to ask is, why does this spaced repetition work? It has to do with the way our brains encode information. By repeatedly engaging with information at intervals, you signal to your brain that it's important, which helps solidify it into your long-term memory. The second strategy is active recall. Another incredibly effective strategy is active recall. This means actively trying to retrieve that information from memory instead of passively rereading or rewatching something. When you actively recall, you're forcing your brain to pull up the information, which strengthens your memory. An example of this would be after you read a chapter or finish a class, pause and try and recall the main points without looking at any of your notes. You could also quiz yourself or try to explain the concepts to someone else. Think of it this way. If you're passively reviewing, you're reinforcing familiarity, but with active recall, you're reinforcing actual memory. You're practicing retrieval, which makes it easier to recall that information later on. The third strategy is use multiple modalities. Another great way to reinforce learning is by engaging in multiple senses or modalities as you learn. This could mean reading, writing, listening, or discussing the information. For example, if you're learning a new skill, try watching a video, taking notes, and discussing it with a friend. The more ways you interact with the information, the more connections you form in your brain, which strengthens your memory. When you use multiple modalities, you're essentially creating different pathways to retrieve that information later on. If one pathway fades, another's still there. And 4, breaking down the information or making it in bite-sized chunks, manageable chunks for your brain to digest. Now, this is a really important technique for combating the forgetting curve. This is where you break down large amounts of information into smaller, more manageable pieces. Our brains are wired to remember chunks of information rather than long lists or complex ideas. Now let's think of it this way. Say you're trying to remember a list of 15 items. Instead of trying to remember all 15 at once, break them into smaller groups of 3 to 5 items. This technique is also great for concepts or skills that have multiple components. By focusing on smaller chunks, you give yourself a higher chance of remembering and later integrating those details into the bigger picture. The 5th strategy, reflect and apply what you have learned. Finally, one of the best ways to make learning stick is to reflect on it and apply what you have learned. When we find ways to apply knowledge in real-life situations, we reinforce that learning in a really meaningful way. If you learn a new technique at work, try to find a project where you can use it right away. Or If you're learning a language, find opportunities to practice speaking with others. Reflection can also be powerful. Taking a few minutes to think about how the information connects to what you already know can deepen your understanding and retention. So for all of my instructional designers out there, designing a learning plan to beat the forgetting curve. How can we pull all of these strategies together to really and truly combat the forgetting curve? Here's an example of how you might structure a learning plan to really tackle the forgetting curve. First, set clear goals. Decide what you want to learn and why it's important. Having a clear purpose can keep the learner motivated. Create and review a schedule. Incorporate spaced repetition into this learning schedule. Set reminders for reviewing what you have learned at a later date. Then a few days later, and so on and so on. Get that spaced repetition. Quiz yourself regularly. Use active recall by quizzing yourself or having quizzes for your learner on the material. For engaging in those multiple modalities, mix up the learning methods. Have some reading, have some writing, have some listening, and also discussion. And of course, building in some reflection and application. Application is incredibly critical for many of the things and skills and tasks that we learn. Remember, if you don't use it, you lose it. By creating a very structured plan that includes all of those strategies, you're really setting yourself up for success by making a much easier process to retain this content over time. So, here's the ultimate takeaway. The forgetting curve might feel inevitable, and honestly it is. We are humans, we have human brains, but with the right strategies, we can combat it by using techniques like spaced repetition, active recall, and applying what we have learned. We can hold onto knowledge longer and make learning truly stick. Thank you for turning in to Instructional Design in the Real World. I hope today's session has given you some practical tips for taking control of your learning journey. Remember, learning is a skill, and the more you practice, the better you get at it. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and we'll see you in the next episode.